So now we are going to be welcoming Dr. Christina Rinaldi. Dr. Christina Rinaldi is a professor in the Faculty of Education. She teaches and supervises in the School and Clinical Child Psychology program at the University of Alberta and completed her doctorate in School and Applied Child Psychology at McGill University and is a registered psychologist in both Alberta and Quebec. Her professional experience working in schools, hospitals, and mental health settings has informed her teaching and research. Her expertise is in the area of developmental, social, and emotional, psychological functioning and well-being. She teaches and researches how best to assess and foster social and emotional development and functioning in children and adolescents. Her research concentrates on how critical relationships, such as family, teachers, and peers, in early childhood and adolescence support social and emotional learning and development. She is currently leading a study on parenting with mothers and fathers and just completed a school readiness project with early learning preschool programs with a focus on both academic and social and emotional functioning. Please welcome Dr. Christina Rinaldi to do her talk.
Good morning. My topic today is about obviously emotion regulation, and I had to do some myself because I had to find this particular entrance. I took the LRT for the first time, so I was applying a lot of, not the first time, but the first time to get here. So I was applying a lot of those strategies that I'm going to talk about today. I'm not talking about research. I'm going to be talking more about general developmental milestones in early childhood with respect to emotion regulation, and specifically how parents and other important adults in children's lives can contribute to helping foster positive outcomes. So we need to, I suppose, start at the beginning with some definitions just so that we have a common understanding. Emotion is the affective aspects of human experience, and emotion involves a complex interaction of biological, psychological, and environmental influences. So it's multifaceted. With respect to emotion regulation, we know that there are extrinsic and intrinsic processes responsible for monitoring, evaluating, and modifying emotional reactions, especially their intensive and temporal features, to accomplish one's goals. There are some also practitioners and researchers out there who believe that emotion regulation is a response to stress. And to some extent it is. I find that that's a little bit simplified because you can also have, well, we can comment on there could be positive stress or negative stress, and it's a matter of stimulation and how we deal with that. I'm going to briefly review what children do typically in their regulating of emotion. So as early as 0 to 3 months, we see that infants, they are trying to control their I guess, external stimuli through innate physiological mechanisms. They might use approach and withdrawal, and we have one right now who's being comforted. And so they can either use self-soothing or gaze aversion, just as two examples of what infants might be doing to regulate their environment. Between 3 and 6 months, we can see a major transition, and some of you might say, really, Christina, are we expecting them to have these predictable sleep and wake cycles? I know my children didn't necessarily fall into that category, but because of that, and if there is more predictability, there will be an increase in control due to these attention mechanisms that start to develop. But there's a long way for the development in those aspects to occur. By age 1, they have more purposeful kind of controlling and effective arousal. But then between the age of 1 and 2, and we see vast development at this stage, there's kind of a switch from this active to passive strategies. They're trying to engage in more active, even if they can't control their affective states, they can use strategies to manage the affective states. And a key point is that infants really do progress from this passive to more active, more purposeful, and with more cognitive development, more reflective types of ways to regulate. So in early childhood, and specifically into the preschool years, this is the time that these strategies start to develop. They might engage in co-regulation. So we might see that in the form of negotiating, or we might see that in the form of asking for hugs or other ways to be comforted. And then they also might be engaging in self-directed So it could be talking to yourself, self-soothing, breathing out loud, or exhaling. And then passive strategies, which are still very much present, would be things like gaze aversion or not dealing with the task anymore, so disengaging completely. Whereas if we look at more active, which some will look at as being positive, more positive, but also strategies that can get you better outcomes, we see you might want to shift your attention to another activity as opposed to totally taking yourself out of a social situation. But these are strategies that we tend to learn, and a lot of trial and error occurs with testing it out. Some basic steps in emotion regulation are identifying emotions. Do we know what they are? It might seem simple to us, but even identifying them and knowing, and even for adults, I think, and adolescents as well, confusing perhaps the difference between sadness and anger. When you get really happy, does that overlap anymore? Even though they're distinct emotions, does that overlap with anxiousness or feeling a little excited about something? So identifying leads to then the second step of understanding the emotions. And when we understand the emotions, then we hope that we can move to regulating strong emotions, how to deal with them, so that we can function in those social interactions. And related to the theme for today, it is really part of developing social emotional well-being, mental health. These are positive strategies that really serve us well long term. And then our expressing of emotions is also key. So in early childhood, emotion regulation really mainly depends on caregiver support. So parents, caregivers, educators, peers as well. But we're going to focus on the parenting component today and the caregiver component. And sometimes it's a lot of information to think of and to keep in mind. But what could we do as caregivers? We can definitely read signals, and I'm going to also give you some other strategies as to how to do that and how to be aware of triggers and patterns. And respond to ways, and this is really, you're going to say, respond to ways that minimize distress. Obviously, Christina, we want to minimize distress, and how do we practice those ways to minimize? Because sometimes, myself included, have gone in situations where I've contributed to or escalated the amount of distress in a situation. So as a caregiver, we hope to not be in that position, but we know that that happens. So even learning about what has happened, what's worked well in the past, what hasn't. So with respect to positive parenting, these are key features that you, and in my parenting research, comes up over and over again as key components to what we consider healthy or positive ways of interacting with kids. So one of the key features is responsiveness, and this comes out as being you are in tune with your child, you're able to interact with them, and in a way there's some level of mutuality. You read each other's cues, you're in sync, and you're aware of what they bring to your relationship. Warm parenting, as opposed to cold or rejecting or controlling. We look for cooperation. And cooperation, again, requires a back and forth. So it's not just on the parent, it's the exchange with the child, what that child brings. And what we look for specifically, and we're still, even though it's an older term, we're still looking for what kind of fit between parent, caregiver, and that child in their exchange. And then another element of positive parenting that serves us well in understanding and fostering emotion regulation is scaffolding. And I like to use the example of training wheels on a bicycle. The parents really push their child in that particular situation to meet their potential. They usually, or we usually, don't let go of the bicycle until we're a little, maybe more than a little, confident that they're going to go off and not fall, although that is part of the learning experience too, if they do fall. So the part of the scaffolding is to provide support, but not do everything for the child either. So how do you meet that balance of sometimes waiting for someone to tie their shoes, although I know we have Velcro nowadays, so when are we learning to tie laces? But the thing is, okay, we need to get out the door, and I don't have time to wait for this, so I'm going to do it for you. But we've missed opportunities for somebody to do it for themselves. But we know we have time pressures in real life. You end up in those situations for sure. Okay, so what can we do? There's quite a few tips, but I'm going to try to give examples. We can help with regulating negative affect. If they don't have the cues around them to know how to deal with negative affect, we can be there to coach them through it and the next point is demonstrating, probably not in the moment, this is in general day-to-day functioning, to demonstrate positive mood at home. Do we express it? Do we model it? Do we have examples of it so that it can be seen? We can provide emotional support. We can provide it by being there, but also in comforting ways. We can encourage the appropriate expression of emotion, and I'm going to give examples of what I mean. Appropriate means we're evaluating what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And if emotions help you get through things, meet goals, and help you develop to progress, then they're helpful. If they're impeding or are starting to be problematic for you, then they're not helpful, and I'll give you specific examples in a second. So it's important to encourage that and to talk about the causes and consequences of emotions. And I feel for adults sometimes that's a little difficult as well, because sometimes we have to be reflective as to what are the causes and consequences of these emotions and our feelings. So teaching children to experience negative emotions, although it sounds perhaps counterintuitive, why would I want them to? Because it happens. Negative emotions do come up. So how do we process them? How do we deal with them, as opposed to they don't exist? And I'm not saying that that's always the answer, but sometimes it's like we're not gonna pretend that doesn't happen. So with respect to emotion dysregulation, these are not all of them have to occur at the same time, but we can think about that these are possibilities of where the breakdown in the emotion regulation might take place. So we could have limited emotional language, and if that is the case, that's where you would like to target and possibly give skills and strategies and practice. Could be in cognitive rigidity in how you're viewing particular situations and context. A child, an adult, an adolescent as well, but I'm talking about early childhood today, may have a lower inhibition. They may have poor problem solving and abstract reasoning, which can facilitate higher emotion regulation. They may have difficulty reading social and emotional cues. Hence, they may need to practice reading social and emotional cues with different activities. They might have sensitivity to changing environmental situations. Of course, at the core, there's also physiological arousal and neural circuitry that's at play with emotion regulation. So any of these or a combination of these can lead to emotion dysregulation. So what can we do? In response to that, we might have possible coping strategies. We can have instrumental coping strategies, which are active strategies that help us. We might seek help from others. We might engage in venting. We might also lash out, so we could be physically or verbally aggressive. We might engage in avoidance, and they're all coping strategies. We might worry and ruminate. We might engage in self-stimulation. These are some examples of how to cope. Other possible, when I said about healthy and unhealthy, and you might have input on that too, is a way to deal with a stress or stimulation, to exercise, to engage in meditation, to get proper sleep. That's a big one for kids. Parents are like, are they sleeping well and are they eating well? What's contributing? Versus unhealthy, perhaps self-injury, perhaps that aggression that I talked about, perhaps something like excessive use of social media and technology. I talked about self-soothing, that too. It can be a positive, overly used. Does it turn to unhealthy? So those are important things to consider in understanding how children are regulating and coping. I'm using just one example, and it's the cognitive behavioral example. This one's for an adult, but I'm going to take you through with understanding for children in a situation perhaps where they get aroused with some stimuli. They might have a thought about it. Perhaps it's about a toy and not sharing the toy. And their thought could be, in a situation where they're with peers, I never get to get this toy. It's always someone else who gets it, and I never get a turn. So their emotions could be frustration, maybe anxiety, perhaps anger. So yes, you can have multiple emotions at once. And the physical reaction could be getting tense in the body, getting upset about the situation, even though it hasn't even happened. They're in that situation. And the behavior might be bop. Perhaps you could take different scenarios and apply what might be going through. And so the emotions are not being regulated based on the behavior we end up seeing. But the emotions are reasonable given what the child is thinking about and where they're coming to that particular situation. So with respect to promoting success As caregivers or parents or teachers, can we focus on emotion triggers, be aware of what they are so that we can be preventative, acknowledge that children can have multiple emotions, maybe work on understanding how it affects their body, so more of the physiological response, how my body feels. You can use that for helpful tips. Emotions can be hidden, but they also can be changed. Experience success, either self-confidence boosting activities, give children opportunities to be successful in opportunities, and then obviously gain that confidence through doing. And acknowledging the positive is always going back to the parenting styles of warmth, is very important. And I mentioned before, good self-care. So sleep, eating, physical activity, health maintenance, can't, in all aspects of life, for any human being of any age, very important. So by the end of preschool, children are able to do possibly all of these. And if they're not, we need to target. If they're not able to talk comfortably about emotions, if they're not able to use strategies to prevent being overwhelmed. And sometimes we can slip into that at different stages of development as well. So by the end of preschool, they also can perhaps use play to deal with difficult challenges, and I'm just pulling some, and connect specific and appropriate feelings with events. So how would I like to promote self-management? Some of the main tips that we keep doing. I know, looks very relaxed. So relaxing for sure, identifying what those internal triggers and conflicts might be, possibly using imagery, using comforting self-statements. These are maybe easier said than done, but working to resist impulses, delaying gratification, that's a tough one, but it helps with regulating emotion, especially if you want something right now, and practicing patience, which I tell myself as well. So takeaway messages, emotions and emotion regulation are essential for healthy functioning. Our opportunities to practice happens every day. My LRT experience, I'm sure you have an experience maybe even before. Parents, caregivers, teachers, we all support through modeling and coaching of emotion regulation, and we can express them positively or negatively. My time's up already. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Questions?
Yes, we've got about a few minutes for a couple of questions here. So please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question for Dr. Rinaldi. Yes.
Right. No, good point. I mean, you have to see what strategies would work and if they're able to feel perhaps, especially when they get tense, even if you're reflecting it to it, they have to be able to respond, yeah, that's it. Because if you're saying you seem tense or you're bunching up your hands or sometimes you have to comment on those kind of obvious, but you can't comment on how they're feeling internally. For instance, if they have butterflies or if they're tense about something. So it doesn't mean that you can't model how you feel when you're upset or how you might be able to communicate that. So that's one way for them to perhaps relate or understand, okay, so when mom's upset about something, she says she feels tense in that. So it might not happen immediately, but by communicating that as well and by showing how you're processing that, there could be. So even if they're not able to, they're hearing to the fact that others do feel certain things when they're processing an emotion or in an emotional state. No, absolutely. And part of what, and not all can access supports, but what we hope is perhaps the parents too reach out and talk to others about how to become a little bit more mindful. But you're right. I mean, especially in a busy, not only about capacity to do that, but also in a very busy kind of society, we don't do it even if we have the capacity a lot of the time. So it's almost a luxury sometimes to step back and to have that time to be able to either ask other people or to reflect for self. Absolutely. Excellent points. Yeah, I mean, there's observational learning a lot of the time. I'm not as familiar with working with children who have perhaps those delays or communication difficulties, but there are other ways. Either they can watch other people, there are games that they can play. It doesn't rely so much on the communication so much, but perhaps clicking on a social scenario. For instance, they have some comic strips or different kinds of cartoons that are appropriate, but that can teach how to problem solve in those situations, and that might not rely on the verbal, but might ask for problem solving to figure out what the solution might be. So there are different kinds of strategies that could be used that don't heavily rely, even though some or a few of the tips were definitely language based. Well, I haven't had to personally develop specific strategies for ASD population. However, in the studies, and I've only looked at a few that have tried to look at emotion regulation, in this particular population, there's great variation. They have really focused on those positive strategies when children tend to use more passive strategies and their parents tend to use more passive strategies, so the avoidance or the over-reliance on gaze aversion or things like that. While they are strategies, we see better benefits for social emotional functioning when some of the more active ones are employed. So even though it might be very difficult to engage in relaxation or meditation, at a cognitive level, perhaps there would be other ways to relax the self and to experience calmness. Those are some strategies that we can do with even very young children, just by kind of working with the environment and being able to identify the triggers. I think that works with any child. What are the triggers for this particular child? And either if the triggers are going to continue to happen, so we don't have any control over that, how can we prepare them to deal with the triggers? So it's very specific, I think, on what's key for that particular child.
So I think that probably brings us to the end of the question period. I know there were a few more questions, but I believe Dr. Rinaldi will be around during the break period. If there are any more questions, you can sort of direct them to her. So I want to thank you very much for your presentation today, Dr. Rinaldi, from all of us. Thank you.